Milk snakes are one of my favorite type of snakes out there. You usually hear me talking about boas and pituophas, but this amazing and beautiful North American colubrid is definitely up there, and I don't talk about them enough. Their Latin name is Lampropeltis triangulum, and they range from Canada all the way down to parts of South America. Now, like a lot of the subjects on this channel, depending on who you want to have a fight with, the amount of species and subspecies can vary quite a bit, from the high teens to the high 20s. So, despite the fact of all of that nonsense that will come up obviously, they do vary quite a bit despite a lot of their commonalities. They have a generalistic diet, they make great captives, as well as they do vary quite a bit in habitat, in location, as well as size and coloration. Typically, they are well known for those red, black, and yellow bands, but they don't all look like that. So today, I want to talk about 5 different milk snake subspecies that you may never have heard of. And to start things off with, we're going to start it with a banger, of course, one of the biggest milk snakes in the world, the Ecuadorian milk snake, often called the South American milk snake, or in Latin, Lampropeltis triangulum microfolus. Now, these guys endemically range from parts of Central America all the way down to the northwestern part of South America. Basically, from parts of Costa Rica all the way down to the northernmost part of the Andes mountain range. So these guys do vary quite a bit, both in the actual range of their habitat, so from beachside up into cloud forest. So that also means that they range in elevation from sea level into the several thousands of feet. These guys are often classified as a more montane species, similar to that of the black milks and the Andean milks, which means you can keep them at cooler temps. Now, when I said they are one of the biggest ones, I did mean that. These guys are up there contending with the Hondurans, the blacks, and the Andeans as the largest subspecies of milk snake, achieving lengths of 6 feet or more, which is awesome. As well as being very large, though well known for their more darker coloration. They're not always very dark, but a lot of the ones that we have in the hobby typically are darker in color. They have the usual red, yellow, and black bands. However, that black kind of seeps into the other colors, giving them something of like a muddy or dark look to them, which can lead to a bit of confusion. When you actually look at them as adults, they oftentimes look very similar to that of the Andean milk snake, which leads to a bit of controversy, of course. Now, a lot of, if not all of the ones that we have here in the hobby, they can find traced back to a single pair of animals. Now, as you do deep dives into this hobby about different species, the actual origins of where a lot of the animals come from gets a little murky. And in the case with this one, they know for sure that one of the original pair was a wild-caught animal from a more Central American part, as well as the other one comes from the furthest south part of their range, where it very likely could have been, at least a lot of people suspect, that it was either an Andean Ecuadorian cross or just a straight Andean, which is why a lot of the times they are referred to as South American, not pure Ecuadorian. So I believe that there are some pure ones out there, but for the most part what we have in the hobby, that's why they're usually called South American. And then depending on, again, who you want to argue with, the different localities. Next up on the list is one that is very rare in the hobby. And as we go along in the video, it is going to become increasingly harder to find them in the hobby as well. That means that there is increasingly less amount of info out there. When less than a dozen people keep them across the entire United States and only 2 or 3 people really post about it, there's not a whole lot to go off of. However, these are still some really cool animals, and I would love to share them with you guys. And that is this next one, the Jalisco milk snake, or Lampropeltis triangulum arcifa, or articifa. Here it is. We all know I can't pronounce anything, right? This is a Mexican-type milk snake, and yes, I'm aware that Mexican milk snake is its own subspecies. However, there are quite a few of them actually across the entire country of Mexico that are fairly similar, and just for time-saving purposes, I will refer to them just as a Mexican-type milk snake. The Jalisco milk snake, obviously not a Mexican milk snake, but a very beautiful animal that comes from parts of central Mexico and more arid areas. Now, these guys are a more average-sized milk snake in that 3.5 to 4 foot-ish length animal, and they do have the typical red, yellow, and black pattern. And most of the time they have a solid black head with these kind of cool yellow sideburns. However, in the case of the Jalisco, especially a lot of the ones that we have in the hobby, they're very dark animals, a very heavily melanated animal, to where that black, especially over the dorsal part of the body, is very prominent, and it makes a very distinguished and very striking looking animal. Now, this actually gets to be a little bit of an issue because, especially over in Europe, sorry, UK watchers, a lot of the animals that you have over there, as I've come to find out, are actually improperly labeled Ruthven king snakes. So you might need to do a little bit of backtracking or deep dive and do scale counts of heads of exactly what you have if you think you have a Jalisco milk and you live over in Europe. Or heck, even if you're America, make sure you, although let's be honest, if you're looking for Jaliscos, you probably know where it came from, and you probably know like the 3 people, like the ones that I'm posting here today, where they come from. Now, obviously, they come from a very arid and dry part of the world. They're obviously not living in dry, sandy deserts out in the middle of the day, which means that typically you're looking at a much more crepuscular and nocturnal animal, usually spending their days in the more oak forests or the more vegetated plains areas, under detritus, under logs, and then coming out at night to go eat lizards and frogs and snakes and really anything that they can get their Next up on the list is one that has a really cool, interesting tie to herpetoculture history, and that is the Dixon's milk snake, or Lampropeltis triangulum dixoni. The Dixon's milk snake was named after a really amazing and very, very prolific professor in Texas named James Dixon, who, in addition to being the curator at Texas A&M, working at several other colleges, helped describe quite a few different species, as well as have a couple named after him, obviously one of which being the Dixon's milk snake. Now, the Dixon's milk snake is another one of the Mexican-type milk snakes that are found in central to southern parts of Mexico, and they are another typically banded one, although they usually have smaller, thinner, but more bands. And they also typically are much more bright and very colorful species of the milk snakes. And honestly, that's really all that we have to go off of. Not too many people keep them. They're not really coming out of Mexico. There are a couple around, mainly with the very specialized keepers out there. They're an average sized milk snake in that 3 to 3.5 foot range, and you would keep them very similar to that of which you would keep a lot of the other Mexican type milk snakes. Next on the list is another Mexican type milk snake. However, it is very different than really all of the other ones in that area, and that is the Atlantic Central American milk snake, or Lampropeltis triangulum polyzona. And I know all of that was a mouthful, and this actually ends up being a little bit of an issue down the road that we'll get to in a second. Now, when I said these ones are different, I did mean that. This is arguably the largest of the Mexican type milk snakes, easily reaching lengths of over 4 feet, closer to 5 in some cases, and they're a very dark species, especially the ones that we have in the hobby. And they're also kind of oddly named. They go through a bit of an optogenetic change to where they're the more typical red, yellow, and black, although usually darker, and as they get older, they will almost become bicolor, where they will be very, very close to solid, just black and red, which is a very unique and very striking and very cool looking milk snake, even different from the other non-typical tri-banded ones like the plains milk snakes. And the part what I said about them being kind of oddly named is because of their natural home range. Despite being called the Atlantic Central American milk snake, they come from parts of central Mexico, technically part of Central America, but their actual range kind of looks like an inverted boot. Like we know how Italy looks like a boot like this, it more is a boot the opposite direction, to where their range is kind of big, fat kind of circle that goes across the Atlantic Gulf, and it kind of goes further west and north to make the heel part of the boot along what is in fact a larger portion of the range along the Pacific coast. So not super helpful at all. In addition to that, despite the fact it has been established for well over 200 years, there are 2 separate subspecies of the Central American milk snake, the Atlantic Central American and the Pacific Central American, whose range is actually further south and, yeah, just like their Atlantic cohort, spans from Pacific to Atlantic. Despite being separated out and described by 2 different scientists for that long of a period of time, Oftentimes, especially in the hobby, probably due to where they were initially harvested from the wild, they're oftentimes just kind of called the same thing, the Atlantic or the Central American milk snake. Although the several people that do keep them, at least here in this country, do distinguish those subspecies. Last on the list is another one that has a little bit of origin controversy, but honestly is one of the more unique species of milks. That is the Blanchard's milk snake, or Blanchardi. So Lamprepeltis triangulum blanchardi. Oftentimes called the Yucatan milk snake. And you could probably guess why. The Yucatan Peninsula, very famous for not only where the big meteor struck down, but also the only other type of turkey in the world other than the common turkey, the ocellated turkey. This is where essentially their entire range is isolated to, is the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Now, when you look at this relatively smaller species of milk, typically they don't exceed lengths of 3.5 feet long, usually staying in that 2.5 to 3 foot range. They're a more reduced pattern animal. In fact, oftentimes you'll see them be entirely patternless, and that has to do with their origins. So just like when we think about that Jalisco milk snake and even the Ecuadorian milk snake where their origins and misidentification comes into play, this has to do with the Blanchardi as well. Essentially, we found a male, wild-caught, fully patternless animal, and then a female of unknown origin that came from a zoo that may or may not have been a Blanchardi intergrade, because more than just the Blanchardi occupies that peninsula and was caught and potentially caught from an outlier out there. So an intergrade being a naturally occurring hybrid, like same with that Andean Ecuadorian before. This could be a Blanchardi and one or two other subspecies of milks out there. So very likely that all of the ones we have in the hobby could potentially be low percentage intergrades, which is why most of the time they're not called Blanchards or Blanchardi. They're often just called Yucatan milk snakes. Really, really amazing animal. And technically, because that original wild male was that patternless, very close to all of the ones from that lineage are all heterozygous for patternless, which is really cool. And so you will see oftentimes even animals that are not showing that visual full patternless morph, essentially, you will see a lot of reduced pattern in there. They're a very beautiful red color when they do have that reduced pattern. They're a very, very rare animal to have, although I do see them. I think there's even a pair, by the time I'm recording this right now, on Morph Market of patternless Yucatan milk snakes. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. Sorry it wasn't nearly as in-depth as I usually try to make it, but when you end up starting to deep dive into some of these very unique, very rare species of reptiles, there isn't really a whole lot out there about them, but just to kind of show and share that they do exist and maybe put some spotlight on some of the different breeders and keepers that I highlighted in today's video. Maybe give them a follow, learn even more from them. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. If you want to check out any of the other playlists of like my top 5, whatever playlist, you can please go check that out. Really helps the click-through rate for me, helps YouTube let me know that I exist. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell notifications. We're really getting really close to 5,000 subs. Love for that to get there. So again, thank you all so much. Hope you're having a great day, and we'll check you next time.